over the weekend, I went to a 1K at Mindful Games, which is a local game store in Tacoma, Washington. It's a little drive for me, but I made the trip to try and prove my worth as an Ira player. I ended up doing pretty well. Here's the list that I played for the event. It's basically just my kitchen sink list, except I've added a couple more sideboard cards. I took out some of the humbles, put in some amnesias, just some small changes here and there. The list seemed pretty good, but I've made some changes that I'll talk about later. We can just discuss, I guess, my road to top 8, and I did make second at this event and split the finals, so I got a cool 300 bucks, and I'm going to use it to go buy a Yu-Gi-Oh deck, so that's pretty sweet. So round 1, I played against a Zen player. This Zen player was a little bit new to the game. I mean, they played pretty well. I just had a really strong start, just sending a ton of disruption, the way that this deck really does, and Zen can struggle to handle all the disruption a lot of the time. My opponent also struggled to find the Transcend early, so he really just didn't have too much of a game there. And then going into round 2, I was playing against the only Enigma at the event, and I think my Ira deck is really strong into Enigma, and this is a player who I've played against a lot. We go to a lot of the same armories, and we've also done some testing online for even specifically this matchup. We played about like 6 or 7 games, I think, in one of our sessions of just this matchup with something very close to the deck I was running. In that game, I just sent a ton of damage, and my opponent was trying to trade damage with Scar for Scar and Phantasmaclasms, but in the end, he wasn't able to establish any sort of big board. Really, the way Enigma wins the matchup is that they need to land Restless Coalescence with Astral Etchings using their arm piece, and then stop all of your Kodachis forever. My opponent just wasn't successful in being able to get that online. They attempted a pivot off of Mirror Guy, but I had a double strike in my arsenal basically every single turn of the game until that moment, so I was really ready for any sort of big push with Mirror Guy, and I easily cleared it and took the game. Going into round 3, one thing that's really important with this deck is to make sure that you're in the winner's bracket, because my deck is very specifically tuned to beat all of the top 6 or 7 decks in the meta except for new. And unfortunately, I got paired down in round 3, and I got paired down into Aelia, which is probably our worst matchup. So many things that Aelia does just turn off our whole deck. They have the Lace with Frailties and the Codex of Frailties, Red in the Ledger. It's just all bad. We play 0 D-Reacts, so if we ever get on the back foot, there's really just no way out, and we're just getting hit for 14 over and over. They were on a more interesting Sandscour New Horizon build that was still playing mostly regular cards and just a couple of the good pieces that use aim counters like Immobilizing Shot, which I learned is actually not super good against Ira. Immobilizing Shot doesn't stop you from using your weapons on the same turn where you play an attack action card, but it didn't end up mattering. There was a point at which I was down about 15 life, and I slowly grinded it back and was able to take 2 cards on one of their turns, but they ended up being able to dominate an arrow, and I ended up dying. So going into round 3, I had tried my best to try and stay in the winner's bracket to avoid any rangers or assassins hanging about, but we got paired into it anyways, and I lost round 3. Round 4 was against another Zen, and this is a Zen player that I've played a lot. They live a little ways away from me, but we often go to armories that are kind of equidistant from, where we both live. And this game was actually really exciting for a lot of it. I was on the good side of variance for this game a lot of the time. What this game 4 against Zen really showed me was that you need to be digging for the correct pieces, and as long as you're digging as much as possible and playing to your outs, you can really just win any game. What happened is my opponent ended up transcending fairly early, but the turn that they went to use their hat, I had attacked them with Command and Conquer for 7. So they felt as if they were priced in to using their hat to prevent the Command and Conquer on hit on the Sync Blow in their arsenal, because they also had another Sync Blow in hand. So they used their hat, found the chi, and then I was able to also send an Amnesia that turn, that they had to use even more cards to block out. So the turn was something like Kodachi, Command and Conquer, Bittering Thorns, Amnesia. They took the Kodachi, I played even bigger than that, Command and Conquer. They blocked with their hat, and then they blocked with the Sync Blow from Arsenal on the Bittering Thorns, and then I played the Amnesia, and then they had to block with another card and their other Sync Blow from hand to block out the Amnesia. And what that meant was that they weren't really able to do anything crazy off of this turn. I don't think they even were able to play a Chase the Tail. They just played a Mauling Chi basically for that turn. And I was off to a pretty strong start there, but the life totals were pretty even, although my opponent had used most of their, or half of their armor at this point. Their feet and their headpiece was gone. But it is important to try and get the chess piece off the board as fast as possible, because if they're able to ever block 2 and then make the Zen State token, things can get kind of iffy because that first Kodachi won't hit. So I'm, playing my regular game plan, but at some point I whiff on enough disruption and they're able to play a pretty strong turn, so I'm down a little bit of life. And so I have to block a little bit. And then we come to one turn where I have a red even bigger than that, and it's just a 2-card hand, and so the first Kodachi hits, and I opt the top 3, and none of them were good enough, so I had to put them all on the bottom, and then I ended up top decking the Command and Conquer off the even bigger than that in order to disrupt their turn. So they ended up blocking out and kind of playing a slower turn, and I gained some tempo that way. And then the next turn, I was able to play a stronger, even bigger than that turn, where I went Kodachi Censor into Kodachi even bigger than that again, and then that even bigger, the second, so on the first even bigger than that red, I opted 2 to the bottom because I didn't find any card that I really wanted to draw off my next even bigger than that. Really, I was just looking for exactly Command and Conquer or Amnesia at this point. There was nothing else that could even possibly get me out of the game. And then on the second even bigger than that, which was a yellow, I looked at the top 2, and it was a blue and a Take the Tempo. And I knew that those weren't going to be enough to get me there, so I decided to bottom both and just, hope that the top card of the deck was going to be good enough. And it ended up being a Command and Conquer on the top of the deck for the second turn in a row. And my opponent kind of tilted after that. They ended up taking 7 and then taking a Mass Trigger, which they might have forgotten about, to give me another card. And their arsenal was an Ancestral Harmony. They ended up playing a gigantic turn, where if they had had Ancestral Harmony, they would probably have gotten like another +5 points. So their giant Chase the Tail turn would have turned into like, a 25 damage turn instead of like a 20 damage turn. With that, I was able to bring them closer to Kodachi lock and eventually took out the game. Then in the 5th round, I played against Aurora. I think Aurora is by far our most favored matchup in this build. The deck is just not able to handle disruption from multiple points. A lot of Auroras are actually running the full combo build into Ira. I think that is probably correct into most Ira builds, but my Ira build is specifically built to counter the full combo Ira package. My opponent, though, brought a full suite of equipment, including even Lightning Greaves for the extra 1 block. I guess they're trying to block 7 on the first Command and Conquer to try and keep tempo. My opponent was a newer player, but they were very good. They said they hadn't gone to a lot of armories, but or tournaments in general, but they played with a lot of friends who were quite good. And they were, experienced card game player, so they were definitely playing really well. I guess in general, they had a slight misconception about what my deck was going to do, which oftentimes is what happens when people play against my Ira. They go into the game thinking, okay, let's play a mid-range game, maybe block with my 3 blocks, and block out important on-hits because Ira can't put out that many. And then eventually, I'm just going to draw a great turn that I can pivot off of and win the game off of that. And if you do that against my Ira, I'm just going to keep presenting more and more damage, and eventually you're just going to get hit by Weakest Link into Erase Face and die. And that's what happened that game. I proceeded to play 6 turns in a row where I presented double disruption or disruption plus something like a snatch or a take the tempo. and my opponent ended up blocking a ton, and especially considering they blocked with their armor pretty early, which, if you see the first Command & Conquer as Aurora, it feels pretty safe to block with your armor, but when the Command & Conquer has Go again, it's sometimes a different story, and I was able to just deal so much damage with interaction that the game wasn't really close. I was up like 15 and just Kodachi locking them. So I'm 4-1 in a 5-round tournament, and that means I'm in top 8 at second. The first seed was an Aurora player who was different than the one who I just beat. He's a local of mine who I test with often, and then me. And then third seed was the Enigma player who I had beaten round 2. The fourth seed was a Viscerai player who was slightly new to Viscerai, but he was a ProQuest winner. He's been to the Pro Tour, a very good player. The fifth seed was the Aurora player that I'd beaten in round 5. The sixth seed was a new player who had won ProQuest in the past, went to the Pro Tour, and although wasn't super up to date on exactly how to play new, he'd played new before, but not super seriously. The seventh seed was a Yarl player who I have played a lot, actually, for somebody who doesn't live particularly close to me. They live probably like an hour, 2 hours away, but we've played quite a bit. And the last time we played at a ProQuest was in Uprising meta, when Oldhim and Icelander and Fi were the best decks, and we played an Icelander mirror, and he beat me there. And then the 8th seed was a Viscerai player who I'm really good friends with, and we play other card games too together. But he's also a very good player who I don't know that he has won any ProQuest, but he makes top 8s all the time. He was a big Prism player before Prism kind of got neutered, and now he's playing Viscerai. I'm the second seed, which means I'm playing against Yarl, which is actually a really scary matchup for this deck. If you look at the Talishar stats, Ira is really favored into Yarl. And I think that if you are playing something like 9 or 12 D-Reacts, and you're planning on just grinding Yarl down and blocking out as much damage as possible and utilizing Kodachis to just bring their life total to 0 over the course of 20 turns, then I think that plan is actually pretty good into Yarl, but my deck is really bad into Yarl. Like, I think Yarl is probably like 65 plus favored into my Ira deck. So I was quite scared for this match, and I mean, all my fears were realized in the first 3 turns. He had played Terra Sunder on Oakenold, not fused Oakenold, but then the second Oakenold he played was fused. So I was just down like 20 life. There was a point where I was at 1 and my opponent was at like high teens life total. But I knew that my opponent had used a lot of his aggressive tools in the matchup already. I think he still had maybe like 1 pummel left in the deck, and he was also on CYB, but he hadn't actually played very many CYBs yet. He'd only played 1, and we were like somewhere like 3/4 of the way through the first cycle. At least I was very close to being done with my first cycle because of the even bigger than that ops. There was a turn where my opponent attacked for 4 with Titan's Fist, and I ended up blocking 5 on it because I was playing around a pummel off of the 2 cards that they had left in their hand. It was difficult to know whether or not their hand actually had a threat in it because I had just attacked for 4 the turn before, and they had used a D-React, so there was really no way to know exactly what was in their hand. But it was the pummel, so I played around the pummel going to exactly 1. And then going into the next turn, my opponent had a very weak hand and were really only able to attack for 3 with their Titan's Fist. And I was able to take some tempo back by playing out some larger attacks. And my opponent blocked down to 1 card, forgetting that Channel Mount Eisen has to have you pitch an ice card in order for you to, win the game off of it. And then my opponent also made a bigger mistake in the end game where I attacked for 3 with Rowdy Locals and they were at 2. And Rowdy Locals gets pumped if you block with an action card, and they blocked with an action card. And I said, oh, okay, it gets pumped by 2, thinking my opponent would play out a Counter Blessings or a defense reaction. And instead, they looked at their hand and said, oh, and then they died. A little loose play from my opponent's part. They're a really good player, and I definitely respect them as a player, but, their game wasn't too clean that game. And that was the semifinals, and then that was the quarterfinals. Moving into the semis, I played against the new player who had just taken down the Enigma player, which they were really excited about because that matchup is not particularly good, especially because they're on a much slower new build. The new deck they were playing had Count Your Blessings in it, and that matchup is also just a really bad one. Siren's Call and Codex of Frailty are both just really good against the deck, but my opponent on turn 0 ended up playing out a Siren's Call and a Codex of Frailty on turn 0 because they just had to get cards out of their hand. They ended up arsenaling a Justinic that turn, but it also just gave me an arsenal because I had blocked an attack on the dagger that they had sent. And so I just had a little bit of tempo, and I was able to get an early life lead, although, this is CYB new, so you can't really count those super hard, but my opponent ended up making some weak arsenal decisions that meant that they ended up having to block with Codex of Frailties when they really didn't want to. They were playing a little too much around Bonds of Agony, I think, arsenaling cards like, Venomous Bite, and even after they had found a time to play out the Venomous Bite on an attack, they decided to arsenal the Fang Strike, which I think is probably a mistake. In the end game, they tried to bait me into allowing the Fang Strike to have value by attacking with Command and Conquer for 6, thinking maybe, oh, I'd forgotten that there's a Fang Strike in there. I hadn't forgotten. I blocked with my Tunic to make sure that I couldn't get Fang Striked on the Command and Conquer to lose my arsenal. Or no, sorry. I instead just decided not to block instead of blocking for 6, and I just lost my arsenal instead. At that point, I was up something like 19 to low, like maybe 5 or 4 or something like that. So I ended up just taking the 6, and then he pumped it to 7 in order just to get it out of his arsenal because he needed space. But at that point, he'd used 3 Codex of Frailties, and not in ways that were particularly beneficial, that he had just had to get rid of them because his arsenal was just not clearable. And he had used 2 Sirens Calls, so I felt very safe, and I ended up being able to take that game with the Kadachi lock. And then moving on to the finals, we decided to split the pot beforehand, but for these events, there is experience you gain, which qualifies you for the 2.5K at the end of the series. It's a 7-month series of tournaments that ends in a 2.5K invitational, and both me and my opponent were desperately looking for experience points because we wanted in on the big tournament at the end. So we were playing pretty seriously, and if you go to the Mindful Games YouTube channel, you can see a live stream of that final game. I wasn't on stream any other time of the day, which is kind of unfortunate, but it is what it is. This deck is good against Viscerai compared to other Ira lists I've played, but I think the Viscerai matchup is somewhere around 50-50, at least with the build that I presented the day that I went to the tournament. Unfortunately, Humble and Amnesia just are not enough, and Erase Face are just not enough to take Viscerai off his game. The way the game played out is very similar to how other Viscerai games have played out for my Ira deck, where my opponent plays some value hands early and blocks a lot, but sends 2-card hands with damage, leaving Rune Chance on the table. And then they find an Arsenal card, arsenal it, and proceed to block out and play Malefics for the rest of the game. And when this happens, you really just have to turn on the gas and try and kill them, which I attempted to do. And my opponent was somebody who was very familiar with my build, who knew basically all my tricks. We've played so many games of Viscerai versus this Ira deck in particular, and he was able to play around a lot of stuff. One funny part is At one point, he ends up blocking with Face Purgatory for 7, and I think he's blocking with an attack and non-attack, which I was ready for because I was going to discard it down in a Nasty Surprise in order to get a Might, Vigor, and Agility. But my opponent hadn't actually blocked with an attack and non-attack, so I attempted to discard the Nasty Surprise, and instead I wasn't allowed to, and I just had to hold the blue for the next turn. My opponent ended up being able to block out most of the damage, and it gets to the point where my opponent is at around 10 and I'm at something like 30-ish, maybe 28, something like that. And my opponent ends up sending a Mordred Tide with 5 Malefics on the battlefield into a pretty big damage turn, and I end up going to, I think, 6-ish. And then I basically have to send lethal this turn or I'm going to die. Especially considering sometimes, you just draw all reds against Viscerai when they're sending Rune Chants at you and you just can't do anything and you die. So I end up being able to present a lot of damage with disruptive on hits, and then at the end I have 1 card in my arsenal and I have a resource floating, and my opponent thinks, oh, you're going to present lethal through my blocks, and I'll have to block with my last card, and I won't have another turn for the rest of the game. And instead, my arsenal is a Rowdy Locals for 2 when my opponent is at 4. So any other card in my deck that's playable at that moment that's not a blue is lethal. But I had just arsenaled the Rowdy Locals off of Mask of Momentum, so I wasn't able to get the damage in that I needed to, and my opponent ended up living at 2, and I died the next turn. So that was my experience at the 1K. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of this deck and some decisions I've made concerning the tech cards that are in my newest build that I made after my experiences with the deck this weekend. Mostly the main board is the same. All the equipment's the same. This really isn't ever going to change except maybe Warmonger's Diplomacy for blue Flusterfist. Or Dishonor because it makes the deck more expensive. But I added an extra Humble because I really liked Humble against Zen. Zen is a deck where you just have to present insane on hits every single turn, or they're going to just play a ton of overrate chase the tail turns, and you're not going to be able to get over their value with that. So I really like having the 3 Weakest Link, 3 Amnesia, at least 2 Humble. I'm thinking about cutting the Down and Dirty for the Humble. Sometimes Down and Dirty is quite good against the Assassins and Aelia and Riptide. Sometimes you find it late and it just kind of sucks. The old build was running 2 Down and Dirty, and I think that's a mistake. I think you want to be running 1 Down and Dirty maximum, and I'm thinking about cutting it to 0 and replacing it with a Humble. Be prepared if I do that. The other interesting card that wasn't on the list before is Hand Behind the Pen. After a lot of reps against Viscerai, I've decided that most Viscerais will come up with a game plan that involves playing out a bunch of Malefics after arsenaling a Mordred Tide and then killing me with a Mordred Tide and Malefics. Now, if my opponent doesn't have a Mordred Tide in their arsenal, the Malefics are significantly weaker. And the Mordred Tide on those turns often represents something like 10 value, maybe even more than that, right? Especially considering it's a starter. Him Behind the Pen is the best card that can target and destroy a Mordred Tide in an arsenal. So I want to be able to kill it, so I put in a couple more Command & Conquer specifically for Viscerai. There's a couple other matchups where you can play it. For example, I put it into Aelia, where they arsenal a lot of buffs, and Him Behind the Pen kind of just works like Command & Conquer in those scenarios as well. And you can actually read all of that in the detailed matchup guide that I've made for my newest version of Kitchen Sink. I'll put this link in the description of this video. I've gone over every matchup, except there's a couple that basically just don't matter that I left out. Maybe I'll go back and put them back in. The matchups that matter the most are the matchups that I put the most thought into with my descriptions. You can see The Viscerai description is quite long. So yeah, if you want to access this again, this is going to be in the description. And if this helped you out at all, please like and subscribe to this video.